We're live. All right, good. And the show started. So go ahead,
No,
Charles.
let's go ahead. You go ahead. You were talking about Zero
Well,
Brain.
this weekend, I'm polishing my glasses like an old man here. This weekend, I ran into a situation where I finally needed to break down and use an integrated debugger to work on a project. It was too complicated for me to figure out what was going on purely by visual inspection or using a few print statements here and there. Now, I got a new client that I'm working with, and they got a very complicated piece of code. They needed something fixed really fast, so I didn't have time like I normally would to sort of like dig in and just get the whole thing in my head. So I needed to get my hands on a debugger that would work, and I was using Sublime. And if the Sublime guys are listening, hey, I'm sorry. I love your product, but I was having a lot of problems. I don't know if it's you or what. I was just having troubles. So I looked for another tool this weekend, and I ended up going with Zero Brain. And my fear is that I would be spending a lot of time figuring out a new tool, but it was really quick to use, easy to install, easy to set up, and it just worked out of the box. And I was able to do the debugging. There were a couple things that are a little bit different between the two editors, so I kind of had to work through that, but I found the problem and fixed it, so good enough.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I never really got into the debugger in Sublime, so you
Yeah,
have to do a lot of configuration and stuff. That, at least I had. I don't know.
I think this is a slippery slope. Slippery. I've already noticed it actually. I used Zero Brain this weekend on their project, and then I was sort of like doing the warm up for the Hangout today, and I'm like, oh well, I'm in Zero Brain. I must go and use it, and I'm starting to use the debugger all the time now. I don't know if this is going to make me a better developer or lazy or what, but there
Well,
I
yeah,
am.
it's good to have tools at your fingertips, though.
There we are.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, guys. We're back here to talk about desktop game development. This is Corona Geek number 167. And if you haven't already, you need to go to youtube.com/Corona Geek and you need to watch the other sessions because we've got, what, 4 of them now? Have we done
4 or
4?
5, yeah.
4 or 5, yeah. We've talked about the differences between desktop and mobile, the interactions and the things that you need to know and the inputs. We've talked about how to set up your project. We've looked at how to work with third-party assets and create reticles, which if you don't know what that is, you definitely need to go watch the Hangout to figure out what we're talking about. And we've also looked at how to create animations on the desktop, which isn't really a whole lot different than it is in mobile, but there are some differences when it comes to aiming and to moving things around and stuff like that. So we've been talking a little bit about that, and we're going to talk about that some more today as well. So joining us on the panel is Dr. Brian Burton down in Abilene. You can find his stuff over at burtonsmediagroup.com. Also joining us is Ed Marina from roaminggamer.com. Also joining us is Kevin from SeaburnGames.com. And we've got Steven Johnson from Zabalba Studios from down in Mexico. I always want to sing like something about umbrella drinks or something. What is it? What's his name? You know what I'm talking about? You know what I'm talking about? Nobody's going to say it. Okay.
You're killing me.
Jimmy Buffett or
In
Jimmy
paradise,
Buffett.
something
Jimmy
in
Buffett. Yeah,
paradise.
Jimmy Buffett. Yeah, Jimmy Buffett. For some reason, my brain went blank. I had a drink in my hand, and I was wearing flip flops and a Hawaiian shirt, but I couldn't remember his name. So anyway, so thanks for joining us. Thanks for being here. And before we get into today's show, does anybody have any kind of announcements or anything they want to share?
I do, but you guys go first.
Okay, going once, going twice. Well, I will say it's not official yet, and we haven't announced anything yet. But if you watch this show, you get the inside scoop. So here we go. We're getting ready to announce very rough alpha support for TVOS. So if you are in that camp, you want to play with it, and you're kind of you don't want to have to go off and learn Objective-C or something like that or Swift. Then you're going to want to check out the TVOS support when it's officially announced. So I say it's alpha. It's definitely rough alpha. In that, we've got the Pew Pew example, which if you haven't checked out the sample code that comes with Corona, there's a Pew Pew example, which is the desktop version of the game where you have multiplayer inputs, and it works on TVOS. Now, there hasn't been a whole lot of testing done, so so that's where we say it's kind of, it's alpha, definitely alpha, and TVOS and iOS are, there's overlapping similarities, but there's also things that are very, very different. If you do any sort of reading on TVOS, you'll those things will be highlighted right away, so we won't cover those here. But in terms of packaging things up and getting things out the door, you're going to need Enterprise to do that, because TVOS has some requirements in terms of top shelf graphics and just assets that go along in the TVOS, the Apple TV user experience, that the build process doesn't account for right now. So you need to be able to jump into Enterprise to be able to flip those flags and make everything work, so that if you do want to publish something to the store, you'd have the level of control that you need to be able to do that. So not everybody is comfortable with Enterprise, but that's kind of the state of things right now. And the last thing that I'll say on it is that we're working on getting the Mac desktop and Windows desktop platforms to the point where they're out of beta and polished and ready to go, prime time, all that kind of stuff. So engineering resources are tied up there, along with regular bug fixes and feature requests and things like that come in all the time anyway. So so TVOS is basically a lower priority. It's definitely something that we are excited about as well, but you gotta put things in order and address them in some sort of priority. So that's it. But I'm excited about it. I think it's going to be cool, and we're going to put out some, the docs and tutorials and all that stuff up in the coming days and weeks. Ed, I saw you were excited about that.
I'm excited. I just need to unmute myself there before I got my woohoo out. Awesome.
I'm hoping we can roll some of the, like once we get a little further down the road, we can maybe roll that into our desktop conversation. Maybe,
sure,
I don't know. We'll see.
I don't know,
maybe,
but you're gonna have to do some of the testing, because I got nothing.
Yeah, well, I've got the device here, and there's some things that we should be able to do in the simulator. So
now you've got the stick controller, right? Not the joystick.
Yeah, so I actually have I don't have the.
Sticky.
Yeah, I don't have a controller. I just have
it's got a mouse.
Siri remote.
Yeah. That's a mouse, right? At the top.
It's a trackpad. Yeah, it's a glass trackpad. So
yeah.
So
what I should do is when that gets rolling along, I should package up a quick demo just to key map and trackpad test your device to make sure that works.
Right, exactly, and we can
just try that on the show.
Right. There you go. So I think that's going to be fun. I mean, it's going to be a different interaction set.
That's
right?
what I always do with my clients and other folks, is when they come to me and go, "Yeah, I got some new input I want." I'm like, "Okay, well, we got to make an input tester first."
Right. Yeah. You can't just run forward without knowing if you can do the basics. So.
I want to hook it up to their ear, and if they wiggle their ear, then I want the input. No.
Yeah. Right. Nah. Thanks for playing.
So I do have announcements, but only when you're done.
Yes, I'm done.
Okay, so I'm going to show you my screen. I'm just going to run through these announcements really quick so we can get on to the good stuff. Share screen. All right, you can see my screen, yeah?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to give the link. We're not going to read this, obviously, but there's an article on my site showing some changes in my behavior lately that will be things I'm going to be doing different. But the essence of it is I am doubling down. I've got some goals I want to meet this year, and I haven't met them yet. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, there's a link in the article to my goals from the beginning of the year. But in order for me to work on my goals, I need to minimize some of my other efforts. So what that means is I'm going to continue my Patreon campaign, but I'm changing it slightly. I'm no longer doing a reward-based campaign in the sense that I won't be emailing people every month and saying, "Here's your answer packs and your other stuff." I'll continue to do answers in the forums, and as a patron, if you want to contact me and you're really jonesing for one of my content packs or something like that, then go ahead and just email me. You can do that. The Hitman service, I'm putting that to bed for the rest of the year, at the very least. I've done several hits now. but I've decided that the return on investment is not quite good enough. Um, so there's more overhead than I expected as far as communication and stuff like that. So I'm taking her down. SSK, I mentioned this last week. That's still going to be out there. I'm still in the middle of doing the super upgrade, whatever release, but I'm not worried about documentation. I'm not worried about backward compatibility. It's going to be my personal kit of joy, and if you want to make it your kit of joy, by all means, it'll be on the Git, and you can get it. There's a link right here. Things I'm going to continue doing. The Hangouts, obviously, this is important, and I want to continue doing it. Answering questions in the forums. Yes, absolutely. I'll continue to do that, and I'll be my usual grumpy self. Promise. Contracting, yes. If you're one of my clients, you know who you are. Yes, I'm going to continue doing that. But the big thing I'm going to be doing is game and app development. Yeah, and I'll still continue to sell my selfie products, so all my content packs and whatnot. So on those notes, I posted an article. I'm going to give a link in the show today, but I gave away all the answer packs that I've thus far produced because I want people to have these and make use of them. There are a total, if I counted correctly, of 61 answered questions across all of the answer packs. So if you haven't gotten them, go get them. They're all in one download. You don't even have to read the article. Just click this link right here at the top. Hitman service is down. I said that. And then the only major announcement after this is that Mike H., I'm just going to say H because if you're listening later, Mike, it's because I still don't want to slaughter your name. I'm so bad with names. I know how to say it, but I'm not going to say it. Mike H. and I, Mike from Crave Creative, and then, of course, me from Roman Gamer, we worked together on a game over the past several months. It is in the mill, so to speak, getting ready for review. It is being reviewed, hopefully, soon. And this is our launch page, our landing page. It's I'll leave it to you. Check it out. So,
oh, cool. All right.
I'll woohoo on a show when it's actually released.
Okay.
Make it through the mill.
Do you want us to link to it as is, or you want to wait until it's ready to go?
Yeah, we can supply the link on the page. The only thing is the let's see. Yeah, the links are live, but they don't actually go to anything until the release occurs. So
Gotcha.
all the links on this page should completely work as soon as the product actually gets out there. So if people want to just read on it now, and then I'll make an announcement again when it's finally released through the mill, as I say, we'll go from there.
Cool. Well, I'll tell you what. I'm excited to hear you. What's the word I'm looking for? You're saying no to some things, even to yourself, right? It's very hard to know when to say no, so that you can say yes to other things, and specifically not just to to yourself and to clients. I think is really hard because there's all these things that you want to do, right? Because you're an inquisitive guy, and all these new products come up, and we talk about stuff every week, and it's like, ooh, I'm gonna check that out, right? But you can't do everything, so you have to say, okay, well, no, you have to sit and you have to do the first thing that you wanted to do, not the 10th thing that came along. And then the second thing is sometimes it's hard to say no to new business or new clients, and as you mentioned, even when it may not be as lucrative as you want it to be, because I have had those times when people come bring me a project and I'm like, it's money. I mean, it's green, but at the same time you're like, but that's going to preclude me from doing other things, so I have to say no to it, and that's really hard sometimes.
Yes, it is true. I deliberated over this for a few weeks and talked with some folks and came to this conclusion. So
yeah, and it's good. It's good. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you push out from the end of the year. I would love to see what kind of result you get between now, because we have maybe 7, 8, 6 weeks. I don't know. Yeah, between now and the end of the year. So it would be interesting to know what kind of productivity you're able to achieve by sort of, as you say, doubling down, and then focusing exclusively at the end of the year. And you know what? I've learned over the past, I don't know, 6 or 7 years that it seems like, especially when you're doing consulting, at the end of the year is always, it's either two things. One is there's no projects, there's no new projects because everybody's focused on the holidays or whatever, or existing clients are just like, they're losing their mind and they're trying to get everything off their desk right before the end of the year.
Well, that's still true. Existing clients are, in fact, will be losing their minds.
You're right.
I already see that happening.
And some of it's just because they're not taking any new business in, so they take that opportunity to sort of clean their desk and reorganize themselves for the end of the year, and that kind of trickles down into all these last minute to dos for you. So you're kind of like, so it's not really new business, but it's new busy work. So I try to.
I don't mean that in a negative way. It's the realization of what happens at the end of the year.
Yeah. Oh, it's good. It's good to. Yeah, it's good to recognize patterns and just be to work with that.
Yeah.
Flow.
Another thing is that sometimes clients come to me when all hope is lost and it's time to just make it happen. So they're already at the stage where they're like, I just got to get this done.
Right. You're right. Which is not something you want dumped in your lap necessarily. So.
Not necessarily. It depends.
Okay. Well, yeah. I'll be interested to see how it works, because I truly believe that once we put our mind to something, once we kind of focus in on something, exceptional results happen. Right? We can spend 6 months thinking about something, but the moment that we talk about, we decide to do it, it's that moment that, like, bam, it gets done, and we're like, oh, well, why did I take so long to mess with that? Why not just do it?
So what you're saying is no pressure, but you better have awesome results for the end of the year.
Yes, well, exactly. You should. I mean, right. You have to be stellar, or we're all gonna feel like,
fired.
Yeah, you're fired. feel like
that's what I usually tell people.
Just our hopes and dreams.
First, it was me. You're fired.
Yeah, our hopes and dreams are hanging in the balance, so no pressure.
Everybody will cry if I don't do well. So speaking of doing well, we're 20 minutes in, and we got several things to cover. I promised people we would take our time, but in order to take our time, I should get started and get rolling.
Let's do it.
All right, good. I'm so rude. Let me fire up my screen here.
And if I remember correctly,
yes, sir.
Today's focus is on. I don't mind.
I'm going to give you the lowdown before we get started.
Okay.
I'm actually I'm going to send you a schedule here later this week, Charles.
Okay.
Because I know that just coordinating the releases and the notes for these shows is hard. So I'm setting up a much more deliberate schedule for these things. So I'll send you my schedule for the next 3 Hangouts or so later, a couple days from now. So,
Sweet.
My estimated schedule. But my estimated schedule for today is to review the game in progress. That is folder 3, which is 3 game, which is the game itself. This is where you're going to go to look at the code that is the final game. You can look at the exploration directory, you can look at the other directories, that's cool. But the one we're working on from now on together is 3 game under I Can Make That, Desktop Games, Top-Down Shooter. And of course, as always, there's going to be a download link with the show notes so people can just get the folder, and this is where you'll start. So look in the 3 game folder, and that's where we're working today. Today I'm going to do a very quick review of the game Lua file because there's been a small change to make things much simpler for folks. I'm trying to break everything up into tiny chunks so they can take a look at just the small chunks. Makes it easier for us to talk to. Then we're going to talk about terrain rendering very, very, very quickly. And then we're going to move into player creation and movement and the camera. So today's goal is to come out of here understanding how we create a player, how we move the player, and how the camera works. So, before we jump into the project, actually, let's go ahead and jump into the project. And you get to see my new fancy environment here. I really like Zero Brain too because it's got this feature where you can just switch between projects in one click, which is really cool. So I used to have to keep a zillion projects open, and then I would always lose track of which one was on which desktop. Now I can just switch between projects and not have to worry about having all those editors open.
Does it save the state of all your tabs?
It saves the state of everything. Everything goes back exactly the way it was, which has always been my problem because I'll accidentally close an editor and lose my state. And I'm like, what files did I have? Where was I? What was I doing? Ugh. So can you read this code okay? Is it big enough?
I think so. It probably could be a little bigger, but I don't know what.
Okay, let's make it a little bit bigger because we got
If you
plenty
can
of
make it
room.
bigger, yeah. If you can make it.
So I'm only going to say this one more time for this show only. When you launch this game, when you are looking at this code, start in main Lua. Main Lua is very short. Basically, you can just zip to the end of the file and see, okay, what's going on? What's going on is I am requiring the game.lua file, and that I'm calling a function on it called create. From there, you should really just jump right into game.lua and take a look at what is different from week to week. Now, what's different this week is big in that I have simplified this file a lot so that in future weeks, all you have to do is say, oh, there's one line of change here, and then I go look at another file, instead of having a lot of changes within this file. So one other note is as I go along, I will continue to clean things up and make them more beautiful, hopefully, and better documented for folks so that they can just more easily grok this. So this is a live project that will hopefully just get better and better for you to understand. But GameLua is a module. I use my typical public module creation here. I just create a table, and then I will attach things to it. I'm going to run through this really fast. What I've done here is I've broken out all of the makers and the managers. So you got makers or builders, which are modules that create content for the game. And then there are managers that are modules that are responsible for managing content or doing some kind of active thing. So for example, the camera manager's job is to keep the things in the right place on the screen so you can see them. It's an active module doing something to the game. Whereas makers generally just produce something and then you use them more like a tool. So they're going to be used by other parts of the games to do work. So the makers in this file so far are the layer maker, which is a module for creating the layers that we looked at last week: underlay, overlay, content, world, all of those display layers that we're going to use to keep things correctly rendering on top of each other, below each other. Debug maker, which is sort of my catch-all for this game development, where I'm going to put tools in here so I can show you some specific content. So this is really not important so much as just so you know it's there, is something I'm using to show you a topic of the week. Like this week's topic is the camera, and you'll see what Debug Maker does for that. Ground Maker, just what it sounds like, it makes the ground. Reticle Maker makes our reticle. And Player Maker makes our player. If you zoom down into this, almost all of these are going to have the same structure. They're going to have a destroy function and a create function. They may have some others, but almost all the maker modules and game module will have these two functions. And then almost always, create will call destroy first. And the job of destroy, this is something that's very important to understand, is in any of the makers, the job of the destroy may not be anything. It may not actually remove any content. I have created that method as a place where if I need to do some cleanup, that is where I'll do it. So for example, let's say I have a module that needs to track some variables locally within the module, but I want them all clean when I load the next level. Then anything I need cleaned would go into the destroy. Whereas all the content that I created will be destroyed as soon as I remove the groups. So in game, I destroy, where is it? Oh, you don't have stuff that we're not doing. I'm sorry. In the, let me find it. Layer Maker, where are you? In Layer Maker, when I switch levels, which we're not doing yet, I will call the destroy method or function, and it will destroy all of the groups, all the display layers, and that will destroy all of the content in our game, all the display objects. So what I'm saying here is the destroy functions in all of the other makers, they don't destroy the content they made. They just do cleanup locally on that module if anything needs to be done. Most of them don't do anything. Player Maker doesn't do anything. Reticle Maker doesn't have any cleanup to do because it doesn't have any state. It doesn't have any concept of there's something specific I did I need to clean up. However, the Camera Manager has something that it needs to do. It needs to detach itself from the content it was watching and be prepared in a moment to look at something else and start tracking it. We're going to talk about that today. Okay, so again, there's a destroy function, a create function. We looked at these last week, but I just wanted to point out that all the modules are going to start using this sort of nomenclature, this sort of construction. So the big difference you're going to notice this week is it's very much simpler. In here we call destroy, then I use the layers maker to create the layers. Last week this was all in this code, I took it out. Then I used the ground maker to draw the background of the ground. Again, this is all in the code previously, but now it's in its own module. And that is nice because this is the module right here for the ground. 55 lines of code that you can easily look at and understand separately for how the ground is drawn. Now, our ground still is very basic. It's just a checkerboard with one texture. But the point is the more we change it, it only changes in this module, so you don't have to say, well, how did that affect the game module? It didn't. And then we create the reticle, again with a maker, and the player with a maker. Then I set up my debug output and attach the camera, and then I detach it, so we'll talk about that in a minute. But I attach the camera to the player, and the game is running. At that point, if I start the game running, where's my, there it is, a little bit weird, sorry, still getting used to this. If I start the game running, there's my guy walking around, the camera is tracking him, everything looks cool. So that was the first part of what I wanted to show you. Now before I jump into the code, I want to take you to a special example that I made this week for understanding cameras. Understanding cameras it's extremely simple once you see how it works, but the first time trying to wrap your head around the concept of what a camera is and what it does it's a little confusing. So in order to make this as simple as possible, I have created a new project or a new folder within the top-down shooter app folder. It's called 5 Camera Principles. And I will switch to that now. And then I will show you what it does, and then I will explain it. It is basically one file, main Lua, 66 lines of code, which I'll zoom in on so we can read it in a minute. But when we run it, you should run it, and what you're going to see is you're going to see some random backgrounds. So you see a bunch of circles here that are drawn in the background. They're supposed to represent, in a sense, the ground, the content that we don't want to move. And then our player is the thing they're supposed to be doing our moving. So this little smiley guy is our player. And the mappings for this are left, right, up, down keys on your keyboard. And if you press any of those, make sure I'm selected here so I can move up, down, left, right. And as you can see, the player is moving, but nothing else is moving, which is not what we want. But I split this into 2 steps so you can see how it works. So here I am moving my player around, and then when I want the camera to update, you press the C button on the keyboard, and then it effectively does a camera update. Now before we look at the code, how cameras work in general is they are a frame-to-frame calculation, and what they do is the camera is initialized, it looks at, inspects, if you will, the object that it's supposed to be tracking, the tracking object. So the tracking object for our games is the player. And then what it does is on the inspection, it sets up some variables and says, okay, this is where the tracking object was the last time I looked at it. And then it does nothing. And then on the next frame, it says, okay, has the tracking object moved? What do? I do something special if it has moved. Now, the camera we're using is a fixed camera. A fixed camera will, and there's different names for this, forgive me if you use a different name, but the essence of a fixed camera is keep the player looking like it's in the same position it always was from frame to frame and have the entire world move smoothly around it. So what that means is our player is in the center of the screen when it starts. It will always render in the center of the screen, and the world will seem to be moving around it as it moves around the screen. Now, from frame to frame, what the camera does, as I said, is it says, did the player move? Okay, it did move. I need to make it, or I'm sorry, the tracking object, I need to make some kind of calculation to make all these things realign. And how that works is, get a sip of water here.
The cliffhanger.
Okay, yeah, cliffhanger. Okay, so let's just look at the code. So here's the code for our camera example. You can ignore the first part of this up until common. And so on line 9, I'm loading the common from our game, which has some variables like center X, center Y for the screen center. Just ease of use. I didn't really need to do this, but I did it because I wanted it to be similar to the game. Okay, here's the trick of a camera. When you make a camera, what you need is you need a group that is the frustum, the camera lens, in a sense. Not the lens, but like the part of the world that it is tracking. And then you need one or more groups that contain your world content. So you're going to have, for any camera, you're going to have a minimum of 2 groups. And my personal naming convention is I call the one that is being updated by the camera, I call it the world. And then anything that I put in there, I call content. I may have more layers. I may have content sublayers, etc., etc. But what I do is I create this group called content, in the simplest case, and insert it into the world. So now I have the world, and I have everything in the world. And everything in the world will go into content or one of its children. I will not put them into the world group. All right. So knowing that, in this example, what I did was I created 200 randomly placed circles, and I placed them between -200 and +200, the center of the screen, basically, an offset up and down, left and right of the center. In other words, let me just reload it. This is I'm freaking out here. All right, let's try that again. Sorry, this is what happens when you use a new editor. So when I load it, basically what you get is a semi-square looking shape where it's laid out 200 circles. And every time I reload this, I get a different random layout. Slowly. A little bit slower with a debugger. And there it is again. So this content all goes into the content group. Then on top of that, I create my player object, which is the object that I will be tracking. My camera code will be tracking. I also put it into the content layer. And then I place it in the center of the screen because that's where I want to track my object. So I put it in the center. And then I initialize my camera. Now there's no camera module in this example. This is raw code showing you the very fundamental parts of the camera. In a minute, I will switch over and show you the camera module and show you how it does the same things, but in a much nicer way. But right now, I'm doing it sort of longhand. So remember how I said that the camera needs to initialize? So I initialize my camera, in a sense, by saying the last X and the last Y position of the player were this, and I track those on the world object. I could put them anywhere, but for convenience, I know that the world is my camera lens, in a sense. So my camera lens is tracking the last X and Y position of the player. That's the initialization. I forgot, you can't edit. You cannot type while you are running. This is one thing that keeps throwing me off. So there's our initialization. And for convenience, I set up a key listener. So you recall that I said left, right, up, down keys would move the player. So I just created a key listener that when I press those buttons and release them, it will move the player to the left, to the right, down, and up, or up and down simply by adding 50 to its x or y coordinates or subtracting 50. So again, if I press up, I subtract 50 from the y, press down, I add 50 to the y, and so on and so forth. So I have a very simple movement model. So that's all that does. The only other piece of this code is instead of doing from frame to frame an update, I wanted to break it up so you could visually see what was happening. You press C, and that's as if the enter frame code ran and it did the update. It basically moved the world. So this is basically the initialization on line 29 and 30, and this. What will be happening in a normal situation is every frame this piece of code will be running over and over, just once per frame. So what it does is it says calculate the delta x and the delta y by subtracting the last x, subtracting the current x from the last x. Subtract the current y from the last y. Now, if I was smart, I could say if dx equals 0 and dy equals 0, do nothing. But I'm just going to let it do all the calculations every time. It's a little bit inefficient, but what I'm saying here is right now, every time this code executes, it's going to do the next steps. But if you want to be super efficient, you say if dx equals 0 and dy equals 0, then return end. Do nothing, because you have no work to do.
What is now line 46? You're saying you're going one step further and being a little more verbose and saying, okay, what's its value, or what's its what's its value?
The mistake I was making earlier when I canceled that code out was I had I'll separate them out so you can see them. I had this OPR no. That would always execute to true. Yes. So I wasn't saving myself any time at all.
So it wasn't failing, it just wasn't benefiting you at all.
It wasn't doing what I wanted. It was actually costing me more than if I had left it out in the first place. Because you have to do the, it does the check every time, but it doesn't do me any good. So anyways, long story short, you can't just check for a variable and assume that if it's assigned to 0 that it's going to be considered false. You have to actually do a comparison. If it's a Boolean, you're good.
So what I see there is that if you're coming from different languages, you should probably do some very simple assumption testing to make sure that you're getting the results that you think you should be getting.
Right. And I just want to say that one thing is that Stephen pointed out correctly. Let's go ahead and do it. There's a thing called coercion. I'm sorry. First of all, I was a little quick on the response there. Yes, Charles, you're right. If you're making assumptions coming from another language, you should absolutely sit down and confirm your assumptions, because you know what they say about making assumptions. So I've been doing it now for several years, has had no negative benefit or side effects, other than maybe a little bit of wasted execution here and there. But I was completely floored when I realized that I had been making this mistake. And I didn't realize it until I was working on some client's code, and I said, wait, that's not right. And then sure enough, it wasn't right. So, but what Stephen was saying is there's a thing called coercion in Lua and other languages. And what you can do here is you can use the not operator. I believe it's an operator or statement. And that'll coerce this variable into a Boolean. It's essentially the same as doing a comparison, because the comparison also coerces the final result to be a Boolean. So, but I like the word coerce. It's a nice. I'm always coercing or co-opting or. So let's get Bob out of here, because Bob is definitely not part of our code. You're out of here, Bob.
You're fired.
Okay, so we got 5 minutes left. I'm always doing this, but we covered the really important part here, okay? Cameras. You must walk away from today's Hangout and go play with example 5, whatever I called it, camera basics or fundamentals or whatever that was called, and just understand this and then look at the camera module. But let's go back to game. So we got the reticle, very boring. It's just, we talked about it previously. Nothing has changed about our reticle. Run this code so you can see it. I didn't mess up the code. Get in the front. Here's our reticle, this little white dealy bobber, okay? That's it. It just tracks the position of the mouse, and we use it for rotating our player. So what about our player? Let's take a look at him or her. Our player is created on the next line using the maker, player maker module, and the create function, and we pass in the reticle. We pass in the reticle because the player cares about the reticle in the sense that it needs to be pointing in the direction that the reticle is at any moment time, any particular moment, so that we can fire in the right direction and walk in the right direction. Player, 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 player. So let's zoom in, go to the top, go to the top. Stop running. Player maker, just like all the others. Public module, that is a table called public, is the thing that I'm going to attach all my functionality to in return to create a basic module. This module uses a lot of other scripts. Both it uses the physics, it uses common, it uses a bunch of other makers. It uses a layer maker to get the current layers. It uses the sprite maker. Well, it doesn't really, but the green archer uses the sprite maker, so I could in theory take this out. This will get loaded as soon as we load the green archer maker. The green archer maker is the thing that draws our sprites. We looked at it last week. Our little dude walking around gives us all the animations. The arrow maker, we're not using it yet. I'm just going to comment that out. We'll use that next week or the week after. And then we use the Math 2D plugin that I produced and you should use instead of writing these things yourself. So it uses several modules. As we improve the player and give it the ability to fire and pick up things, it's going to start using other modules. So you should expect to see this part of the file expand over time. But for right now, all the player can do is walk in these cardinal directions: north, south, east, west, and then the 4 variants: north, northwest, southwest, northeast, southeast. So 8 directions. So those are what I call the base walking angles. Now the reason that I had to have this table just in advance of this discussion is because the animations, as you will recall from last week, use north, northeast, whatever, but I needed the angles for doing some calculations. So rather than go back and forth and write very longhand code, I just simply created a table where I could pass in, I could say something like this. Well, I could basically do this and get 0 out for my calculation. As you will often see in my code, I localize things. I like to have my functions run as fast as possible, and the way to do that is through localization, as I've mentioned before. And then, as all of the modules will be, we have a destroy function and a create. Create, as you recognize from the call previously, takes a variable called reticle. I could have called it anything, but I'm a big fan of using the same names wherever I can, so I'm calling it reticle. I can call it Bob, my favorite other variable. You'll see Bob a lot in my code. If you see Bob in my code, that means I was doing some debugging. So Bob's my go-to debugger guy. So we call destroy first. Doesn't do anything the first time around, and in fact right now it doesn't do anything because there's no cleanup. Maybe later. The player is a very complicated object. I'm sure later there will be things that we need to clean up, but right now it's fairly simple. It only walks around and tracks the position of the reticle. The very first thing we do is we, as I said, destroy. Then we ask the layer maker to give us the layers. We say, give us the layers that were created previously in game. So we get those and store them here. And then we create our player. Our player, we did this before. We call the green archer maker. We call the create function. We pass in the group we want to put it in, the position we want it at, and the scaling. So we're going to scale it at a 1. If we wanted to make it bigger, we can make this a 2. That would give us a big player. We're not going to do that. So we'll stop that. The point here is not to be distracting. So there's our create function, all in one line of code. We've created our player. However, we need to do a little more work here. And actually, I could probably move this into the player maker. I might do that. So next week, this may disappear. But for now, we need to add the body. We need to make it a dynamic body because it's going to move around. It's going to use movement. And so you've got dynamic for moving bodies, static for bodies that don't move, and kinematic for bodies that can move but do not respond to forces. Well, we want our player to respond to forces because we're going to use forces to move it. And as it is moving, it's dynamic. We make the body simply a circle, so we give it a radius of 25. And if I were to turn on the debug, I'm not running it right now, you would see a little circle. I like to use circular bodies wherever possible because they're simpler. And also, I find them to be a little more forgiving and tight-fitting, especially for players and enemies, because oftentimes players and enemies in games will have arbitrary shapes, and so people try their darndest to make the bounding shape match exactly the shape of their enemy or player. And then what they do is they either create a shape that's too complicated, has more than 8 vertices, or they make a mistake in the winding, which is the order the vertices go in, or some other mistake. And so it's very complicated. They go through all this work when they could have simply made a circular body, which isn't exact, but it's close enough for the situation they're in. Shooters, platformers, most of them can get by with either square bodies or circular bodies. So I encourage people not to make your life too hard and create an actual body shape. So if we wanted to, we could create a table called, we could call it body shape, and then include it as shape equals and whatever the table was, and that table would contain a series of vertices, positions x, y, x, y.
I'm glad you're saying this, Ed, because I've messed with that in the past, and as you said, trying to understand the unwindings, and it's just it's a pain, and you could obviously use a primitive shape like a circular or a square, but then you kind of feel like maybe you're not doing it right, because you're like, well, I have an ability to do all these other more fine-grained things. Maybe that's
exactly
the way I should be doing it.
People feel like, well, because the feature's there, I have to use it. No. The other thing is circles are best because they are the fastest. You got to think about what the physics engine is doing on the underneath. Underneath, it's doing a calculation that says, was there a collision? Was there a collision? The simplest collision calculation is the radius calculation, or a diameter, if you want to look at it that way. Simply saying, is the center of this object within a certain distance of another object? And it's a little more complicated than that. I'm under-explaining it a bit. But the point is circle-to-circle collisions are the simplest calculation you can do. It's simply a distance calculation. Once you get a square or a triangle or a quadrilateral, whatever it is. Well, quadrilateral is a square. Sorry. It's a rectangle, is it not? Anyways, correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen. Steve's probably like, Ed, you're doing that wrong. The point is...
4 sides.
4 sides, yeah. So it's a rectangle. Well, it doesn't have to be a rectangle because it doesn't have to be parallel to each other. That's right. Quadrilaterals the sides are not necessarily parallel. Okay, anyways, the point is, once you graduate... Charles is laughing. Once you graduate to a vertices-based body, the calculations go through the roof. Now we're talking about calculus. And calculus is way more expensive than doing geometric calculations. They're geometrically more expensive. No, literally. I mean, these numbers are not entirely accurate, but if a circle calculation is a 1, a triangle is going to be probably start off at 4 times as expensive, and then a square is twice as expensive as that, and it just goes up every time you add a vertices. So not quite. That's not exactly right, but it's quite expensive. So long story short, get by with a circle body, or if you can't, get by with the simplest body you can, either a triangle or a rectangle.
Well, and in general, that's probably a good practice in general, right? Don't overcomplicate something until you have a reason to do so.
Yeah, it's going to make your code harder to understand, and it's going to make your games slower. Stop doing the help. I don't need help. I'm not trying to get help for folks. This thing is, I really love it because, I got to tell you, Zero Brain is actually pretty cool because I didn't tell it. It just knew where to look, and it gets all this stuff. It tells you all these cool things, like here's telling you about the filter, etc. So it's like,
Right.
yeah, that's pretty cool. So, okay, so we're using my collision calculator, which is another plugin you can get. And what it lets you do is instead of making your life hard and having to do math calculations, you set up all your collision metrics calculations using names. And so if we look briefly, I know I'm running us out of time here. We did this last week, but if we look briefly at common, which is where I set up the calculator, the rules are very simple. I created, first thing I did, I created a new calculator, and then I said, these are the kinds of objects that will be colliding. We have a player type, enemy type, player bullet, enemy bullet, and other. And I figured, that's enough things. If I need to add more types, I'll add them later. Then I set up the basic rules. I said the player collides with enemies and enemy bullets. And then at that point, then I said enemy collides with player and player bullets, and other, I'm just going to guess, collides with the player bullet, and the enemy bullet, but not the enemies. Maybe? I don't know. I haven't used it yet. But the point is, I didn't do any math, and now all my filters are set up. I don't have to go 1 plus 6, 7. Is my mask bit 7 or is it 9? I can't remember. And then if you change it, and then you got to go back and do all your calculations. No, you know what? If I needed a Bob type, Bob, and I needed the player to collide with the Bob type, done. 2 seconds of typing, 5 seconds if you're slow like me on the show. No additional calculations. All the math is done for you. It's guaranteed to work. Done. So I get people in the forums all the time doing these, and I say, use my collision calculator. And I say, I don't understand it. No, it's really simple, man. Get with it. Do it. You can do it. I shouldn't talk like that. Yeah, I don't understand.
Get with it, man. Get with it.
Get with the program, man. No, really. I understand. It's one more layer of learning. So, but in this case, you're saving yourself learning. You don't learn about it in this case if you don't need to. Boy, by which I mean the calculations. All right, so let me skip over some of this. Thinking. Let's go right into the movement because that's what we care about. So what I did for movement was very similar to what I did in the example we just looked at. I set up a key listener, and then if the A or left key, the D or right key, so you can use the WASD keys or the arrow keys on your keyboard. If those are pressed, I do some kind of calculation. And what that calculation is I add a value to move X and move Y, which are variables on our player that I initialized up here. And I'm not moving the player directly. Not like in the example where I move it to the left by 10 pixels or the right by 10 pixels. I'm using physics. So what I'm doing is when the player hits the key, I track that they hit the key and I add that to a variable that the player has attached to it. And then down here, I have an enter frame listener. And the enter frame listener basically says, was there a change to the player's move variables? Where is it? Oh, sorry. Here it is. Was there a change to the move Y? Because you can only move in the Y direction. I'm ignoring all the other keys. So this code is actually going to get simpler. Originally, we can move left, right, up, and down. But now we only move forward. So the W key and the up key are the only ones that make you move. And you move in the direction, not running it. And then I'll let us go after this because I always run us over. Yeah, I move in the, hello. Okay, Knuckles. What's going on here? Okay, I've broken the code. Good job. I have done something. Okay, Stack Overflow. Sorry. It must be Bob. Is Bob in here? Bob, are you in here? Okay, I've broken the code, doggone it. But the point is, enter frame listener looks for changes on those variables, and we do some calculations. We're just not going to have time to do them this week, but I think we should stop because this is complicated.
Okay.
In a nutshell, what it does is it looks in the direction. It says what direction is the player facing, generate a vector, scale the vector, and then apply that as set linear velocity. So if you're going to look at this week, that's what this code above here did. Am I moving forward? Is the y different? Has it been changed? What direction is it facing? Turn that direction into a vector, and then scale the vector by the speed at which the player moves. In other words, if this value here is higher, this vector is going to be longer, and then apply that as the linear velocity. In other words, set the linear velocity of the player so that it's moving at a fixed rate. Linear velocity is saying a body is moving at a fixed rate. And from frame to frame, that rate will be defined by these two values here, vector x and vector y.
So is this the purpose of this to give us more of an organic feel of the movement? Is that what we're doing?
Yeah. Oh, God, I wish I hadn't broken the code. Give me just 1 second here.
Well, we'll get to see Zero Brain in action here.
Yeah, I got Zero Brain all right. Maybe.
You did change some things earlier.
Yeah, I changed something in the common. Let's make sure I didn't mess up common.
Yeah, you went from common to something. There was an object there that you changed.
Let's zoom out a little bit. Bobby in here? Bob. And layers. Now.
We could really do it. We could do a whole show over troubleshooting because troubleshooting is, it's all good until something stops working.
Oh, I hate it when I mess up code midstream. Okay, you know what? From now on, I'm not allowed to type in live code, man. Not during the show, because this is very bad that I have changed this. There it is. Don't flip out.
Well, at least he's facing the reticle. I mean, he's, just doesn't feel like going anywhere.
Doesn't feel like moving it. Move it, Bob! He's not working. We got to call him Bob.
That's right. He likes to move it. He likes to move it.
I bet you money.
So you're basically just undoing, like back.
Yeah, I'm just Control-Zing everything I did just a minute ago.
It's like code
There
TVOS.
it is. Okay. One of these files was necessary. I commented it out like a fool. Okay, where was it going? Okay, here's the reticle, right? As you can see, the player is facing at a 45-degree angle to the right. If you consider this to be 0, I consider this to be 45, 90, 135, 180, all the way around. What happens when you press the up arrow or the W key is I store the fact that you did that in a variable on the player. I don't actually change the player's position yet. I just update a variable that the player has called moveY. MoveY now contains a negative value when I press W. And what happens is on the next frame, the code says, oh, I have an enter frame listener attached to the player. I need to execute it. Among the other things it does is it checks the moveY variable and it says, moveY has been changed from the last time, or it's got a value in it. Let's go ahead and calculate a vector from the player's position pointing 45 degrees, which is the current facing of the character. So now we've got a vector that represents this angle. Then we scale it so that it is of unit length. Its length is 1. And then in the game, in common, you'll see there's a variable defining how fast the player can walk. And let's say the player can walk 100 pixels per second. I can't remember what the value is. So to get that, what we do is we take that vector we just created and we scale it by 100. So now the vector is 100 pixels long. Then all we got to do is set the player velocity to be the x and y components of that vector, and the player walks up and to the right, or down and to the left, or straight up. It's always going to be in the direction that the player is facing.
And just the red square there is just for our reference, right?
Yeah,
So
we didn't get to talk about that today. So one of the last topic for today was movement limitation. In any game, you're probably going to want to limit the bounds of the world. So currently, this red square represents the bounds of the player's world. Now, the textures get rendered beyond that, but that's just as far as he's allowed to move.
Well, let's pick that up next time.
Yeah,
then.
let's pick that up next week.
Yeah.
Let me just give a preview of next week. So next week, we will talk about movement limitations, which we just hinted at. Then we will talk about adding enemies and enemy navigation 1.0, which is the non-pathfinding enemy navigation. Pathfinding will be a whole episode. That's a very exciting, interesting discussion, but it requires a lot of previous setup. We're not ready for that yet. So in a future episode, we'll talk about A-star or Dijkstra's algorithm or one of the whatever we choose as our pathfinding algorithm, and that'll be very interesting, but it requires tremendous amounts of setup in advance. So we'll save that for a future date.
Well, very, very cool. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put on my daddy hat, and I'm going to tell everybody listening that they should go download this code, go back and, well, download the code, mess with it. Then go back and watch this episode again and follow along with what Ed's doing. Because I know we all want to read a book or watch a video or take a pill that will make us taller, stronger, faster, whatever. And the reality is you can't, those are all things are all good, but you got to put in the time. You just have to put in the time. And sitting there with the code, messing with it, following along, just getting it into your head is the only way that it's going to happen. So Ed's done a great job of explaining all these things and trying to break them out and make them simple, but it's going to be up to you to go back and put in the time so that you can own the information yourself.
Yes, that is rule number one of teaching. You got to do it to learn it.
That's a rule for me. When I do these things, I have to do them myself to learn how to talk about them, because I've tried on previous episodes where like winging it, and that just does not work.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and we forget, right? When we went through school and we were taught to study and we were taught to do all these things, and we sort of inherently get right now that we have to study or we have to put in time, right? And we forget to apply that to different parts of our life. Yeah, we forget to. Yeah,
we forget why I know that's true. I just know it's true.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and the only reason I say putting it on my daddy hat is, when I explain these things to my kids, they're like, "Well, I did that assignment, or I read that book," and I'm like, "Well, did you study? Did you go back and cover the material again? Did you try to do it?" What's that?
Did you use it?
Did you use it? Yeah, that's a very good tool. And just a case in point, yesterday my son backed out of the driveway. He's learning how to drive. He backed out of the driveway, and he should have backed out into the opposite lane so that he could go down the road. And for some reason, he decided to back out to the closest lane, which was oncoming traffic. And fortunately, we're on a very quiet street, but as soon as he did it, he realized what he was doing wrong, because he then had cars facing him, and he was like, "Oh, okay." So then we have very wide streets, so he was able to be like on the shoulder, and then when everything was clear, he pulled over into the lane that he needed to be. But imagine me sitting in the passenger seat, being like, "Okay, do you see what happened there? What went wrong? Let's analyze the situation." but he's experienced
it. Picture you as a teaching driving to your son.
Oh, I know it. And there's there's only so many things that you can like cover, right? You're like, okay, here's the book and here's the instruction, and you've gone with us a million times to a bunch of different places, right? But it's not until you're in the moment that some of those things present themselves, and you're like, okay, do you see what was wrong there? And he said later, he was like, I now understand that concept. I will never forget that.
It's better to learn it in a non-emergency situation, I'll tell you.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Nobody
absolutely.
died, so.
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
I didn't want to say that word.
All right.
But
Well, good.
you know what, Charles? You can
Yeah.
never say that again without having a hat, a special hat. So if you want to say you're putting on the daddy hat ever again, you need to have one, okay?
We'll get a daddy hat.
You need a daddy hat.
A hat with it says daddy on the top. If you happen to come across a daddy hat in the mall, please mail it to me. I will wear it.
Not who's your daddy. Daddy.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's good. That's great. So next week we'll do movement limitations. We'll get into enemies. Maybe do a little bit of navigation 1.0. And I'm excited. I'm really liking where this is headed.
Yes.
So thanks for joining us. Be here next week. We'll talk all about mobile app development and desktop app development using Corona SDK. Until then, have a great week and happy coding.
Adios. Tschüss. Auf Wiedersehen.